Graham Thornycroft, thank you for joining us here today. May I start asking you, could you please tell us a bit about the research you've done, the landmarks or the progress that's made within stigma?
So where are we now in global terms with research about stigma and discrimination? So there's actually been quite a lot of stigma research going on for about 50 years, although until the last decade, largely this was surveys of attitudes or looking at vignettes, asking people what they would do if given a particular situation. But in fact, research has developed a lot in the last 10 years. And the way in which I see stigma is composed of three different elements. The first is what people know about mental health problems, about knowledge. The second is what we feel about our motivations, our emotions. That's our feelings, essentially prejudice, because they're nearly always negative about people with mental health problems. And the third is behaviour. Again, largely negative, largely discrimination. So I see the whole picture about knowledge and attitudes and behaviour. So one of the new things in recent years is to focus upon what people actually do, people with mental health problems and others, namely focusing upon discriminatory behaviours. And we'll be able to track that. We now have measures, especially ratings by people with mental health problems of their experience, but also their anticipation of discrimination. For example, somebody not applying for a job because they expect not to get it. For example, not initiating a relationship because they expect it to fail. Sometimes this is called why try. So now we can measure that anticipated discrimination, and we can measure experienced discrimination. And what we found in different campaigns around the world, because now there are about 12 different countries around the world with national anti-stigma campaigns, is that we can reduce stigma and we can reduce discrimination. And I'll tell you how. The critical active ingredient is called either contact, social contact, interpersonal contact. And what does this mean? It means that the way to reduce stigma is to arrange situations where people who do not have experience of mental health problems have contact with people who do. Now, until recently, we thought that this needed to be direct face-to-face contact. For example, small classrooms. We've done research with police officers, school children, medical students, nursing students, and that's effective to reduce stigma. But now it also looks like if you have virtual or internet or social media contact, that can also be highly effective to reduce stigma.
So if you look at the future, what are the main focus areas we need to pay attention to?
Well, let's take stock about where we are in stigma reduction. Even the best resourced stigma campaigns, for example, in New Zealand, in Scotland, in my own country, in England, have shown perhaps a 10 or a 15% reduction in recent years in stigma. Now that's important, but it means there's still a long way to go. So the first thing is to carry on. This is not a short-term campaign. This requires years of commitment and investment. But also there are very specific gaps, one of which is very few interventions have been carried out in low or in middle income countries. That's changing, and we're seeing, especially in recent years, anti-stigma work in China and in India and some other countries also demonstrating stigma reduction from personal contact, from social contact. Now, another big gap is what policymakers are doing. One type of stigma is sometimes called structural or systemic discrimination. For example, the Minister of Health makes a commitment to new services for cancer and makes no commitment or a very small commitment to new services for mental health, and funding follows. So at the very top of government, again and again, we see investment decisions that reflect politicians acting as if people with mental health are worth less than people with other health conditions. So one gap in what we're doing is this so-called top of government structural or systemic discrimination. But there are other gaps. We haven't yet done a lot of work in how to successfully engage colleagues in the media. Indeed, sometimes campaigners against stigma see media as the enemy, putting about scare stories, stereotypes. That's wrong. We need to see people in the media as potential allies as potential friends working towards social inclusion of people with mental health problems. But we have to see, always the golden rule, we have to see the world from their perspective. We need to realise their timescales. It's a rolling 24-hour media competition. We have to see their need for stories, for features and for stories now. We have to give them something new, we have to launch new events, we have to have special stories available so we can actually help them to help us. And we need narratives, stories of recovery. People who have had mental health problems, who are now getting better, feeling more confident, regaining their place in society.
So we can use the data we get from the research to back up new initiatives or advocacy?
So what politicians and policymakers need is not just proposals for what to do, but hard evidence that this will give good outcomes, have real impact and be cost effective. And now that evidence is growing stronger and stronger. Time and again, the evidence is showing that it's this forms of contact driven by service users, driven by consumers, which is the active ingredient to reduce stigma. But also, we've now got interesting data showing, for example, if you work with bosses of managers and organisations, that £1 spent to reduce stigma can produce £14 of gain, perhaps krona or euros. So it's cost efficient to reduce stigma because, for example, there will be people in any organisation who are either off sick with anxiety or depression, absenteeism, or they're still trying to come into work and carry on, presenteeism, but their productivity is lower because they have a mental health problem, usually anxiety or depression. And if you try to identify those people and try to help them, then their productivity is increased.